All right, so I'm gonna take you guys into my laptop and we're gonna go over some hip joint anatomy to start with. All right, so we're gonna go into my complete anatomy app here, which I love. And I'm gonna show you guys some anatomy of the hip. So most of you know what your hip joint is. It's this joint here, and it's made up by your femur and your pelvis. And as you can see, it is a ball and socket joint in that we've got a ball created by the femur and then a socket created by the pelvis. So that's the hip joint when we just look at the bones. Now, if we add the first layer of connective tissue, so I'm going to come down to the bottom here, click connective tissue, and we're going to add the very first layer. So immediately around that bone or those bones is what we call our capsule. Now, this is a specific layer of the hip capsule called the synovial membrane of the hip capsule. You don't need to worry too much about the fancy name, but what it means is that this layer here, which wraps all the way around your hip joint, it secretes something called synovial fluid. You can think of that like joint lubrication and joint nutrients. So within that lubricating fluid that's created by this layer, you have a ton of nutrients. And that's really important because when we remove that layer and we look at the actual cartilage that lays on top of our femur and that lays inside of our pelvis here, that cartilage is really important to keep healthy over time. Arthritis is the degradation of this cartilage, meaning the breakdown of this cartilage. And this cartilage, both on the pelvis and in the femur, doesn't get very good blood supply. So that's not really how we maintain it over time. The biggest way that we maintain it is via the synovial fluid that is secreted by that same layer that we were talking about earlier. Let's see if we can bring that back here. There we go. So when it comes to keeping this cartilage healthy in the joint, those deep articular structures, we need this fluid that's secreted by this layer, but that's just one piece of the puzzle. What we also need is movement of the hip. We need to fully move one bone on the other bone, whether that's you moving the ball on the socket or you moving the socket on the ball, meaning moving your pelvis on your femur. We need to get that relative motion between those two bones in order to cause a diffusion mechanism that actually pushes those nutrients into the cartilage. So even though we have this layer here which secretes that fluid, if we do not fully move that joint and we don't move it often, we don't get those nutrients actually getting into the cartilage where we need it, and we will see early degradation of that cartilage, which we do not want. So that's just one layer of the hip, or of the hip capsule. When we add on another layer here, it now looks a little bit bigger. So this is now called the fibrous layer of that hip capsule. Once again, it wraps all the way around your hip. And this is the thing that we are often talking about. This is really, really important. Hopefully you can see by looking at this that if this layer was really, really tight, if it was really restricted, you're gonna have a hard time moving one bone on another bone. So your mobility will be compromised if this thing is compromised, if this thing tightens up on you. Now, because that layer is immediately around the hip joint, let's say that we've got inflammation going on in this joint. We've got a joint problem. The first thing that's going to seize up after that, the first thing that we're going to start to find like aberrant findings in, whatever you want to call it, is this hip capsule. So this hip capsule, if we've got joint problems, we're gonna find capsule problems as well. And if we have capsule problems, if this thing's tightened up, we're gonna start to have joint problems. So this capsule is important for that reason. As you can see, we've got the anterior, meaning the front, we've got the lateral, and we've got the posterior capsule. Now, if we wanna stretch that capsule, we're gonna do it differently, whether we're biasing the front, the side, or the back. But the main way that we access this capsule is via hip internal rotation, which is why we discuss that so much. This is the fundamental movement of the hip, and that's when you take this bone and you spin it inwards on your pelvis. Alternatively, you could also move your pelvis on your femur to cause the same relative motion. So that's the fundamental movement of the hip, and it's the main way that we access this deep capsular layer, which, like we said earlier, was really important. We can also access this layer, less so, but still quite a bit, with hip external rotation. Again, what setup we use, what we bias, that's getting a little bit more complicated, but that's dependent on what part of the capsule we want to access, and then we'll choose our setup based on that. So that's the hip capsule. Now, the other thing I want to say about this is that this capsule is also one of the main ways that your brain gets information about this joint. And not only does it get a lot of information from this capsule, meaning that there's a lot of little receptors within this that as soon as you move this joint, it kicks information up to your brain. There's a lot of receptors in that tissue, but also it gets to your brain faster than receptors in tissues like your muscles. So it's kind of a way to fast track information to your brain. So this is one of the main ways that your brain tells where your joint is in space, which is really, really important as well. So again, I could talk a lot about the capsule and why it's important, but I just want you to know that this is what it is. It's important for those and many other reasons. And that's why we're going to discuss it later with a lot of the different exercises that we do. You'll also notice that when we do cars, we have a big rotational component worked into that. So we are maximizing activity of this capsule. We're maximizing activation, kicking information from that capsule up to the brain. We are maximally trying to move one bone on the other bone. So we're trying to maximize movement between these two bones, get all that fluid into that cartilage. Again, cars are a wonderful tool, both for the joint itself and for that capsule. So keep that in mind as well. So that's just a brief overview. I'm not going to dive into, we've got a lot of different layers of muscle here. I'm going to try and keep this really simple. We won't dive into all of that. If you have questions about any specific tissue around the hip, you can always reach out. I'm happy to answer them, but we'll keep it simple. We'll leave it at that for now.